Inside the Whale. 1. When Henry Miller's novel, Tropic of Cancer, appeared in 1935, it was greeted with rather cautious praise, obviously conditioned in some cases by a fear of seeming to enjoy pornography. Among the people who praised it were T.S. Eliot, Herbert Reed, Aldous Huxley, John Dos Passos, Ezra Pound, on the whole, not the writers who are in fashion at this moment. And, in fact, the subject matter of the book, and to a certain extent its mental atmosphere, belong to the 20s rather than to the 30s. Tropic of Cancer is a novel in the first person, or autobiography in the form of a novel, whichever way you like to look at it. Miller himself insists that it is straight autobiography, but the tempo and method of telling the story are those of a novel. It is a story of the American Paris, but not quite along the usual lines, because the Americans who figure in it happen to be people without money. During the boom years, when dollars were plentiful and the exchange value of the franc was low, Paris was invaded by such a swarm of artists, writers, students, dilettanti, sightseers, debauchees, and plain idlers as the world has probably never seen. In some quarters of the town, the so-called artists must actually have outnumbered the working population. Indeed, it has been reckoned that in the late 20s there were as many as 30,000 painters in Paris, most of them impostors. The populace had grown so hardened to artists that gruff-voiced lesbians in corduroy breeches and young men in Grecian or medieval costume could walk the streets without attracting a glance, and along the Seine banks by Notre Dame it was almost impossible to pick one's way between the sketching stools. It was the age of dark horses and neglected genii. The phrase on everybody's lips was quand je serai lancé. As it turned out, nobody was lancé. The slump descended like another ice age. The cosmopolitan mob of artists vanished, and the huge Montparnasse cafes, which only 10 years ago were filled till the small hours by hordes of shrieking poseurs, have turned into darkened tombs in which there are not even any ghosts. It is this world, described in, among other novels, Wyndham Lewis's Tar, that Miller is writing about. But he is dealing only with the underside of it, the lumpenproletarian fringe, which has been able to survive the slump because it is composed partly of genuine artists and partly of genuine scoundrels. The neglected genii, the paranoiacs who are always going to write the novel that will knock Proust into a cocked hat, are there, but they are the only genii in the rather rare moments when they are not scouting about for the next meal. For the most part, it is a story of bug-ridden rooms in working men's hotels, of fights, drinking bouts, cheap brothels, Russian refugees, cadging, swindling, and temporary jobs. And the whole atmosphere of the poor quarters of Paris, as a foreigner sees them, the cobbled alleys, the sour reek of refuse, the bistros with their greasy zinc counters and worn brick floors, the green waters of the Seine, the blue cloaks of the Republican Guard, the crumbling iron urinals, the peculiar sweetish smell of the metro stations, the cigarettes that come to pieces, the pigeons in the Luxembourg Gardens. It is all there, or, at any rate, the feeling of it is there. On the face of it, no material could be less promising. When Tropic of Cancer was published, the Italians were marching into Abyssinia, and Hitler's concentration camps were already bulging. The intellectual foci of the world were Rome, Moscow, and Berlin. It did not seem to be a moment at which a novel of outstanding value was likely to be written about American deadbeats cadging drinks in the Latin Quarter. Of course, a novelist is not obliged to write directly about contemporary history, but a novelist who simply disregards the major public events of the moment is generally either a footler or a plain idiot. From a mere account of the subject matter of Tropic of Cancer, most people would probably assume it to be no more than a bit of naughty left over from the 20s. Actually, nearly everyone who read it saw at once that it was nothing of the kind, but a very remarkable book. How or why remarkable? That question is never easy to answer. It is better to begin by describing the impression that Tropic of Cancer has left on my own mind. When I first opened Tropic of Cancer and saw that it was full of unprintable words, my immediate reaction was a refusal to be impressed. Most people's would be the same, I believe. Nevertheless, after a lapse of time, the atmosphere of the book, besides innumerable details, seemed to linger in my memory in a peculiar way. A year later, Miller's second book, Black Spring, was published. By this time, Tropic of Cancer was much more vividly present in my mind than it had been when I first read it. My first feeling about Black Spring was that it showed a falling off, and it is a fact that it has not the same utility as the other book. Yet, after another year, there were many passages in Black Spring that had also rooted themselves in my memory. Evidently these books are of the sort to leave a flavor behind them, books that create a world of their own, as the saying goes. The books that do this are not necessarily good books. They may be good bad books, like Raffles or the Sherlock Holmes stories, or perverse and morbid books, like Wuthering Heights or The House with the Green Shutters. But now and again there appears a novel which opens up a new world, not by revealing what is strange, but by revealing what is familiar. The truly remarkable thing about Ulysses, for instance, is the commonplaceness of its material. Of course, there is much more in Ulysses than this, because Joyce is a kind of poet and also an elephantine pedant, but his real achievement has been to get the familiar onto paper. He dared, for it is a matter of daring just as much as of technique, to expose the imbecilities of the inner mind, and, in doing so, he discovered an America which was under everybody's nose. Here is a whole world of stuff which you have lived with since childhood, stuff which you supposed to be of its nature incommunicable, and somebody has managed to communicate it. The effect is to break down, at any rate momentarily, the solitude in which the human being lives. When you read certain passages in Ulysses, you feel that Joyce's mind and your mind are one, that he knows all about you, though he has never heard your name, that there exists some world outside time and space in which you and he are together. And though he does not resemble Joyce in other ways, there is a touch of this quality in Henry Miller. Not everywhere, because his work is very uneven, and sometimes, especially in Black Spring, tends to slide away into mere verbiage, or into the squashy universe of the surrealists. But read him for 5 pages, 10 pages, and you feel the peculiar relief that comes not so much from understanding as from being understood. He knows all about me, you feel. He wrote this specially for me, It is as though you could hear a voice speaking to you, a friendly American voice, with no humbug in it, no moral purpose, merely an implicit assumption that we are all alike. For the moment, you have got away from the lies and simplifications, the stylized, marionette-like quality of ordinary fiction, even quite good fiction, and are dealing with the recognizable experiences of human beings. But what kind of experience? What kind of human beings? Miller is writing about the man in the street, and it is, incidentally, rather a pity that it should be a street full of brothels. That is the penalty of leaving your native land. It means transferring your roots into shallower soil. Exile is probably more damaging to a novelist than to a painter or even a poet, because its effect is to take him out of contact with working life and narrow down his range to the street, the cafe, the church, the brothel, and the studio. On the whole, in Miller's books, you are reading about people living the expatriate life, people drinking, talking, meditating, and fornicating, not about people working, marrying, and bringing up children. A pity, because he would have described the one set of activities as well as the other. In Black Spring, there is a wonderful flashback of New York, the swarming Irish-infested New York of the O. Henry period. But the Paris scenes are the best, and, granted their utter worthlessness as social types, the drunks and deadbeats of the cafes are handled with a feeling for character and a mastery of technique that are unapproached in any at all recent novel. All of them are not only credible, but completely familiar. You have the feeling that all their adventures have happened to yourself. Not that they are anything very startling in the way of adventures. Henry gets a job with a melancholy Indian student, gets another job at a dreadful French school during a cold snap when the lavatories are frozen solid, goes on drinking bouts in Le Havre with his friend Collins, the sea captain, goes to brothels where there are wonderful negresses, talks with his friend Van Norden, the novelist, who has got the great novel of the world in his head, but can never bring himself to begin writing it. His friend Carl, on the verge of starvation, is picked up by a wealthy widow who wishes to marry him. They are interminable, Hamlet-like conversations in which Carl tries to decide which is worse, being hungry or sleeping with an old woman. In great detail, he describes his visits to the widow, how he went to the hotel dressed in his best, how before going in he neglected to urinate, so that the whole evening was one long crescendo of torment, etc., etc. And, after all, none of it is true. The widow doesn't even exist. Carl has simply invented her in order to make himself seem important. The whole book is in this vein, more or less. Why is it that these monstrous trivialities are so engrossing? Simply because the whole atmosphere is deeply familiar, because you have all the while the feeling that these things are happening to you. And you have this feeling because somebody has chosen to drop the Geneva language of the ordinary novel and drag the real politic of the inner mind into the open. In Miller's case, it is not so much a question of exploring the mechanisms of the mind as of owning up to everyday facts and everyday emotions. For the truth is that many ordinary people, perhaps an actual majority, do speak and behave in just the way that is recorded here. The callous coarseness with which the characters in Tropic of Cancer talk is very rare in fiction, but it is extremely common in real life. Again and again, I have heard just such conversations from people who were not even aware that they were talking coarsely. It is worth noticing that Tropic of Cancer is not a young man's book. Miller was in his 40s when it was published, and though since then he has produced 3 or 4 others, it is obvious that this first book had been lived with for years. It is one of those books that are slowly matured in poverty and obscurity by people who know what they have got to do and therefore are able to wait. The prose is astonishing, and in parts of Black Spring it is even better. Unfortunately, I cannot quote. Unprintable words occur almost everywhere. But get hold of Tropic of Cancer, get hold of Black Spring, and read especially the first 100 pages. They give you an idea of what can still be done, even at this late date, with English prose. In them, English is treated as a spoken language, but spoken without fear, i.e., without fear of rhetoric or of the unusual or poetical word. The adjective has come back after its 10 years in exile. It is a flowing, swelling prose, a prose with rhythms in it, something quite different from the flat, cautious statements and snack bar dialects that are now in fashion. When a book like Tropic of Cancer appears, it is only natural that the first thing people notice should be its obscenity. Given our current notions of literary decency, it is not at all easy to approach an unprintable book with detachment. Either one is shocked and disgusted, or one is morbidly thrilled, or one is determined above all else not to be impressed. The last is probably the commonest reaction, with the result that unprintable books often get less attention than they deserve. It is rather the fashion to say that nothing is easier than to write an obscene book, that people only do it in order to get themselves talked about and make money, etc., etc. What makes it obvious that this is not the case is that books which are obscene in the police court sense are distinctly uncommon. If there were easy money to be made out of dirty words, a lot more people would be making it. But because obscene books do not appear very frequently, there is a tendency to lump them together, as a rule, quite unjustifiably. Tropic of Cancer has been vaguely associated with 2 other books, Ulysses and Voyage au bout de la nuit, but in neither case is there much resemblance. What Miller has in common with Joyce is a willingness to mention the inane, squalid facts of everyday life. Putting aside differences of technique, the funeral scene in Ulysses, for instance, would fit into Tropic of Cancer. The whole chapter is a sort of confession, an exposé of the frightful inner callousness of the human being. But there the resemblance ends. As a novel, Tropic of Cancer is far inferior to Ulysses. Joyce is an artist, in a sense in which Miller is not, and probably would not wish to be, and in any case, he is attempting much more. He is exploring different states of consciousness, dream, reverie, the Bronze by Gold chapter, drunkenness, etc., and dovetailing them all into a huge, complex pattern, almost like a Victorian plot. Miller is simply a hard-boiled person talking about life, an ordinary American businessman with intellectual courage and a gift for words. It is perhaps significant that he looks exactly like everyone's idea of an American businessman. As for the comparison with Voyage au bout de la nuit, it is even further from the point. Both books use unprintable words, Both are, in some sense, autobiographical, but that is all. Voyage au bout de la nuit is a book with a purpose, and its purpose is to protest against the horror and meaninglessness of modern life. Actually, indeed, of life. It is a cry of unbearable disgust, a voice from the cesspool. Tropic of Cancer is almost exactly the opposite. The thing has become so unusual as to seem almost anomalous, but it is the book of a man who is happy. So is Black Spring, though slightly less so, because tinged in places with nostalgia. With years of lumpen proletarian life behind him, hunger, vagabondage, dirt, failure, nights in the open, battles with immigration officers, endless struggles for a bit of cash, Miller finds that he is enjoying himself. Exactly the aspects of life that fill Céline with horror are the ones that appeal to him. So far from protesting, he is accepting. And the very word acceptance calls up his real affinity, another American, Walt Whitman. But there is something rather curious in being Whitman in the 1930s. It is not certain that if Whitman himself were alive at this moment, he would write anything in the least degree resembling Leaves of Grass. For what he is saying, after all, is I accept. And there is a radical difference between acceptance now and acceptance then. Whitman was writing in a time of unexampled prosperity, but, more than that, he was writing in a country where freedom was something more than a word. The democracy, equality, and comradeship that he is always talking about are not remote ideals, but something that existed in front of his eyes. In mid-19th century America, men felt themselves free and equal, were free and equal, so far as that is possible outside a society of pure communism. There was poverty, and there were even class distinctions, but, except for the Negroes, there was no permanently submerged class. Everyone had inside him, like a kind of core, the knowledge that he could earn a decent living, and earn it without bootlicking. When you read about Mark Twain's Mississippi raftsmen and pilots, or Bret Harte's Western gold miners, they seem more remote than the cannibals of the Stone Age. The reason is simply that they are free human beings. But it is the same, even with the peaceful, domesticated America of the Eastern States, the America of Little Women, Helen's Babies, and Riding Down from Bangor. Life has a buoyant, carefree quality that you can feel as you read, like a physical sensation in your belly. It is this that Whitman is celebrating, though actually he does it very badly, because he is one of those writers who tell you what you ought to feel instead of making you feel it. Luckily for his beliefs, perhaps, he died too early to see the deterioration in American life that came with the rise of large-scale industry and the exploiting of cheap immigrant labor. Miller's outlook is deeply akin to that of Whitman, and nearly everyone who has read him has remarked on this. Tropic of Cancer ends with an especially Whitmanesque passage, in which, after the lecheries, the swindles, the fights, the drinking bouts, and the imbecilities, he simply sits down and watches the Seine flowing past, in a sort of mystical acceptance of the thing as it is. Only, what is he accepting? In the first place, not America, but the ancient bone heap of Europe, where every grain of soil has passed through innumerable human bodies. Secondly, not an epoch of expansion and liberty, but an epoch of fear, tyranny, and regimentation. To say, I accept, in an age like our own, is to say that you accept concentration camps, rubber truncheons, Hitler, Stalin, bombs, aeroplanes, tinned food, machine guns, putches, purges, slogans, bedeau belts, gas masks, submarines, spies, provocateurs, press censorship, secret prisons, aspirins, Hollywood films, and political murders. Not only those things, of course, but those things among others. And, on the whole, this is Henry Miller's attitude. Not quite always, because, at moments, he shows signs of a fairly ordinary kind of literary nostalgia. There is a long passage in the earlier part of Black Spring, in praise of the Middle Ages, which, as prose, must be one of the most remarkable pieces of writing in recent years, but which displays an attitude not very different from that of Chesterton. In Max and the White Phagocytes, there is an attack on modern American civilization, breakfast cereals, cellophane, etc., from the usual angle of the literary man who hates industrialism. But in general, the attitude is, let's swallow it whole. And hence, the seeming preoccupation with indecency and with the dirty handkerchief side of life. It is only seeming, for the truth is that life, ordinary everyday life, consists far more largely of horrors than writers of fiction usually care to admit. Whitman himself accepted a great deal that his contemporaries found unmentionable. For he is not only writing of the prairie, he also wanders through the city and notes the shattered skull of the suicide, the grey sick faces of onanists, etc., etc. But unquestionably our own age, at any rate in Western Europe, is less healthy and hopeful than the age in which Whitman was writing. Unlike Whitman, we live in a shrinking world. The democratic vistas have ended in barbed wire. There is less feeling of creation and growth, less and less emphasis on the cradle, endlessly rocking, more and more emphasis on the teapot, endlessly stewing. To accept civilization as it is practically means accepting decay. It has ceased to be a strenuous attitude and become a passive attitude, even decadent, if that word means anything. But precisely because, in one sense, he is passive to experience, Miller is able to get nearer to the ordinary man than is possible to more purposive writers. For the ordinary man is also passive. Within a narrow circle, home life, and perhaps the trade union or local politics, he feels himself master of his fate. But against major events, he is as helpless as against the elements. So far from endeavoring to influence the future, he simply lies down and lets things happen to him. During the past 10 years, literature has involved itself more and more deeply in politics, with the result that there is now less room in it for the ordinary man than at any time during the past 2 centuries. One can see the change in the prevailing literary attitude by comparing the books written about the Spanish Civil War with those written about the war of 1914 through 18. The immediately striking thing about the Spanish War books, at any rate those written in English, is their shocking dullness and badness. But what is more significant is that almost all of them, right-wing or left-wing, are written from a political angle, by cocksure partisans telling you what to think. whereas the books about the Great War were written by common soldiers or junior officers who did not even pretend to understand what the whole thing was about. Books like All Quiet on the Western Front, Le Faux, A Farewell to Arms, Death of a Hero, Goodbye to All That, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, and A Subaltern on the Somme were written not by propagandists, but by victims. They are saying, in effect, what the hell is this all about? God knows. All we can do is to endure, and though he is not writing about war, nor, on the whole, about unhappiness, this is nearer to Miller's attitude than the omniscience which is now fashionable. The Booster, a short-lived periodical of which he was part editor, used to describe itself in its advertisements as non-political, non-educational, non-progressive, non-cooperative, non-ethical, non-literary, non-consistent, non-contemporary, and Miller's own work could be described in nearly the same terms. It is a voice from the crowd, from the underling, from the third-class carriage, from the ordinary, non-political, non-moral, passive man. I have been using the phrase ordinary man rather loosely, and I have taken it for granted that the ordinary man exists, a thing now denied by some people. I do not mean that the people Miller is writing about constitute a majority, still less that he is writing about proletarians. No English or American novelist has as yet seriously attempted that. And again, the people in Tropic of Cancer fall short of being ordinary to the extent that they are idle, disreputable, and, more or less, artistic. As I have said already, this is a pity, but it is the necessary result of expatriation. Miller's ordinary man is neither the manual worker nor the suburban householder, but the derelict, the déclassé, the adventurer, the American intellectual without roots and without money. Still, the experiences, even of this type, overlap fairly widely with those of more normal people. Miller has been able to get the most out of his rather limited material because he has had the courage to identify with it. The ordinary man, the average sensual man, has been given the power of speech, like Balaam's ass. It will be seen that this is something out of date, or at any rate out of fashion. The average sensual man is out of fashion. The passive, non-political attitude is out of fashion. Preoccupation with sex and truthfulness about the inner life are out of fashion. American Paris is out of fashion. A book like Tropic of Cancer, published at such a time, must be either a tedious preciosity or something unusual, and I think a majority of the people who have read it would agree that it is not the first. It is worth trying to discover just what this escape from the current literary fashion means. But to do that, one has got to see it against its background, that is, against the general development of English literature in the last 20 years since the Great War. Two. When one says that a writer is fashionable, one practically always means that he is admired by people under 30. At the beginning of the period I am speaking of, the years during and immediately after the war, the writer who had the deepest hold upon the thinking young was almost certainly Haussmann. Among people who were adolescent in the years 1910 through 25, Haussmann had an influence which was enormous, and is now not at all easy to understand. In 1920, when I was about 17, I probably knew the whole of A Shropshire Lad by heart. I wonder how much impression A Shropshire Lad makes at this moment on a boy of the same age and more or less the same cast of mind. No doubt he has heard of it and even glanced into it. It might strike him as rather cheaply clever. Probably that would be about all. Yet these are the poems that I and my contemporaries used to recite to ourselves, over and over, in a kind of ecstasy, just as earlier generations had recited Meredith's Love in a Valley, Swinburne's Garden of Proserpine, etc., etc. With my view my heart is laden. For golden friends I had, for many a rose-lipped maiden, and many a light-foot lad. By brooks too broad for leaping, the light-foot boys are laid. The rose-lipped girls are sleeping in fields where roses fade. It just tinkles. But I did not seem to tinkle in 1920. Why does the bubble always burst? To answer that question, one has to take account of the external conditions that make certain writers popular at certain times. Haussmann's poems had not attracted much notice when they were first published. What there was in them that appealed so deeply to a single generation, the generation born round about 1900? In the first place, Haussmann is a country poet. His poems are full of the charm of buried villages, the nostalgia of place names, Clunton and Clunbury, Knighton, Ludlow, on Wenlock Edge, in summertime on Bredon, thatched roofs and the jingle of smithies, the wild jonquils and the pastures, the blue, remembered hills. War poems apart, English verse of the 1910 through 25 period is mostly country. The reason, no doubt, was that the rentier professional class was ceasing once and for all to have any real relationship with the soil. But, at any rate, there prevailed then, far more than now, a kind of snobism of belonging to the country and despising the town. England at that time was hardly more an agricultural country than it is now, but before the light industries began to spread themselves, it was easier to think of it as one. Most middle-class boys grew up within sight of a farm, and, naturally, it was the picturesque side of farm life that appealed to them, the ploughing, harvesting, stack thrashing, and so forth. Unless he has to do it himself, a boy is not likely to notice the horrible drudgery of hoeing turnips, milking cows with chapped teats at 4 in the morning, etc., etc., just before, just after, and, for that matter, during the war, was the great age of the nature poet, the heyday of Richard Jefferies and W. H. Hudson. Rupert Brooke's Grantchester, the star poem of 1913, is nothing but an enormous gush of country sentiment, a sort of accumulated vomit from a stomach stuffed with place names. Considered as a poem, Grantchester is something worse than worthless, but as an illustration of what the thinking middle-class young of that period felt, it is a valuable document. Haussmann, however, did not enthuse over the Rambler roses in the week-ending spirit of Brooke and the others. The country motif is there all the time, but mainly as background. Most of the poems have a quasi-human subject, a kind of idealized rustic, in reality Strephon or Corydon brought up to date. This in itself had a deep appeal. Experience shows that over-civilized people enjoy reading about rustics, key phrase, close to the soil, because they imagine them to be more primitive and passionate than themselves. Hence the Dark Earth novels of Sheila K. Smith, etc. And at that time, a middle-class boy, with his country bias, would identify with an agricultural worker as he would never have thought of doing with a town worker. Most boys had in their minds a vision of an idealized ploughman, gypsy, poacher, or gamekeeper, always pictured as a wild, free, roving blade, living a life of rabbit snaring, cockfighting, horses, beer, and women. Masefield's Everlasting Mercy, another valuable period piece, immensely popular with boys round about the war years, gives you this vision in a very crude form. But Houseman's Maurices and Terences could be taken seriously where Masefield's Saul Kane could not. On this side of him, Houseman was Masefield with a dash of Theocritus. Moreover, all his themes are adolescent: murder, suicide, unhappy love, early death. They deal with the simple, intelligible disasters that give you the feeling of being up against the bedrock facts of life. The sun burns on the half-moon hill. By now the blood has dried, and Maurice amongst the hay lies still, and my knife is in his side. And again, they hang us now in Shrewsbury jail, and whistles blow forlorn, and trains all night groan on the rail, to men that die at morn. It is all more or less in the same tune. Everything comes unstuck. Dick lies long in the churchyard, and Ned lies long in jail. And note also the exquisite self-pity, the nobody loves me feeling. The diamond drops adorning the low mound on the lea. Those are the tears of morning that weeps, but not for thee. Hard cheese, old chap. Such poems might have been written expressly for adolescence. And the unvarying sexual pessimism, the girl always dies or marries someone else, seemed like wisdom to boys who were herded together in public schools and were half inclined to think of women as something unattainable. Whether Houseman ever had the same appeal for girls, I doubt. In his poems, the woman's point of view is not considered. She is merely the nymph, the siren, the treacherous, half-human creature who leads you a little distance and then gives you the slip. But Houseman would not have appealed so deeply to the people who were young in 1920 if it had not been for another strain in him, and that was his blasphemous, antinomian, cynical strain. The fight that always occurs between the generations was exceptionally bitter at the end of the Great War. This was partly due to the war itself, and partly it was an indirect result of the Russian Revolution, but an intellectual struggle was in any case due at about that date. Owing probably to the ease and security of life in England, which even the war hardly disturbed, many people whose ideas were formed in the 80s or earlier had carried them quite unmodified into the 1920s. Meanwhile, so far as the younger generation was concerned, the official beliefs were dissolving like sandcastles. The slump in religious belief, for instance, was spectacular. For several years, the old, young antagonism took on a quality of real hatred. What was left of the war generation had crept out of the massacre to find their elders still bellowing the slogans of 1914, and a slightly younger generation of boys were writhing under the dirty-minded celibate schoolmasters. It was to these that Haussmann appealed, with his implied sexual revolt and his personal grievance against God. He was patriotic, it was true, but in a harmless, old-fashioned way, to the tune of red coats and God Save the Queen, rather than steel helmets and hang the Kaiser. And he was satisfyingly anti-Christian. He stood for a kind of bitter, defiant paganism, a conviction that life is short and the gods are against you, which exactly fitted the prevailing mood of the young. And in all charming, fragile verse that was composed almost entirely of words of one syllable. It will be seen that I have discussed Haussmann as though he were merely a propagandist, an utterer of maxims and quotable bits. Obviously, he was more than that. There is no need to underrate him now, because he was overrated a few years ago. Although one gets into trouble nowadays for saying so. There are a number of poems, Into My Heart, An Air That Kills, for instance, and Is My Team Ploughing, that are not likely to remain long out of favour. But at bottom, it is always a writer's tendency, his purpose, his message, that makes him liked or disliked. The proof of this is the extreme difficulty of seeing any literary merit in a book that seriously damages your deepest beliefs. And no book is ever truly neutral. Some or other tendency is always discernible, in verse as much as in prose, even if it does no more than determine the form and the choice of imagery. But poets who attain wide popularity, like Haussmann, are as a rule definitely gnomic writers. After the war, after Haussmann and the nature poets, there appears a group of writers of completely different tendency. Joyce, Eliot, Pound, Lawrence, Wyndham Lewis, Aldous Huxley, Lytton Strachey. So far as the modern and late 20s go, these are the movement, as surely as the Auden Spender group have been the movement during the past few years. It is true that not all of the gifted writers of the period can be fitted into the pattern. E.M. Forster, for instance, though he wrote his best book in 1923 or thereabouts, was essentially pre-war, and Yeats does not seem in either of his phases to belong to the 20s. Others who were still living, Moore, Conrad, Bennett, Wells, Norman Douglas, had shot their bolt before the war ever happened. On the other hand, a writer who should be added to the group, though in the narrowly literary sense he hardly belongs, is Somerset Maugham. Of course, the dates do not fit exactly. Most of these writers had already published books before the war, but they can be classified as post-war in the same sense that the younger men now writing are post-slump. Equally, of course, you could read through most of the literary papers of the time without grasping that these people are the movement. Even more then than at most times, the big shots of literary journalism were busy pretending that the age before last had not come to an end. Squire ruled the London Mercury. Gibbs and Walpole were the gods of the lending libraries. There was a cult of cheeriness and manliness, beer and cricket, briar pipes and monogamy, and it was at all times possible to earn a few guineas by writing an article denouncing highbrows. But, all the same, it was the despised highbrows who had captured the young. The wind was blowing from Europe, and long before 1930, it had blown the beer and cricket school naked, except for their knighthoods. But the first thing one would notice about the group of writers I have named above is that they do not look like a group. Moreover, several of them would strongly object to being coupled with several of the others. Lawrence and Eliot were in reality antipathetic. Huxley worshipped Lawrence, but was repelled by Joyce. Most of the others would have looked down on Huxley, Strachey, and Morn, and Lewis attacked everyone in turn. Indeed, his reputation as a writer rests largely on these attacks. And yet there is a certain temperamental similarity, evident enough now, though it would not have been so a dozen years ago. What it amounts to is pessimism of outlook. But it is necessary to make clear what is meant by pessimism. If the keynote of the Georgian poets was beauty of nature, the keynote of the post-war writers would be tragic sense of life. The spirit behind Hausmann's poems, for instance, is not tragic, merely querulous. It is hedonism disappointed. The same is true of Hardy, though one ought to make an exception of the dynasts. But the Joyce-Eliot group came later in time. Puritanism is not their main adversary. They are able from the start to see through most of the things that their predecessors had fought for. All of them are temperamentally hostile to the notion of progress. It is felt that progress not only doesn't happen, but ought not to happen. Given this general similarity, there are, of course, differences of approach between the writers I have named, as well as very different degrees of talent. Eliot's pessimism is partly the Christian pessimism, which implies a certain indifference to human misery, partly a lament over the decadence of Western civilization. We are the hollow men. We are the stuffed men, etc., etc. A sort of Twilight of the Gods feeling, which finally leads him, in Sweeney Agonistes, for instance, to achieve the difficult feat of making modern life out to be worse than it is. With Strachey, it is merely a polite 18th century skepticism mixed up with a taste for debunking. With Morn, it is a kind of stoical resignation, the stiff upper lip of the Pukka Sahib somewhere east of Suez, carrying on with his job without believing in it, like an Antonine emperor. Lawrence, at first sight, does not seem to be a pessimistic writer, because, like Dickens, he is a change-of-heart man, and constantly insisting that life here and now would be all right if only you looked at it a little differently. But what he is demanding is a movement away from our mechanized civilization, which is not going to happen, and which he knows is not going to happen. Therefore, his exasperation with the present turns once more into idealization of the past, this time a safely mythical past, the Bronze Age. When Lawrence prefers the Etruscans, his Etruscans, to ourselves, it is difficult not to agree with him, and yet, after all, it is a species of defeatism, because that is not the direction in which the world is moving. The kind of life that he is always pointing to, a life centering round the simple mysteries, sex, earth, fire, water, blood, is merely a lost cause. All he has been able to produce, therefore, is a wish that things would happen in a way in which they are manifestly not going to happen. A wave of generosity or a wave of death, he says, but it is obvious that there are no waves of generosity this side of the horizon. So he flees to Mexico, and then dies at 45, a few years before the wave of death gets going. It will be seen that once again I am speaking of these people as though they were not artists, as though they were merely propagandists putting a message across. And once again, it is obvious that all of them are more than that. It would be absurd, for instance, to look on Ulysses as merely a show-up of the horror of modern life, the dirty Daily Mail era, as Pound put it. Joyce actually is more of a pure artist than most writers. But Ulysses could not have been written by someone who was merely dabbling with word patterns. It is the product of a special vision of life, the vision of a Catholic man who has lost his faith. What Joyce is saying is, here is life without God. Just look at it, and his technical innovations, important though they are there primarily to serve this purpose. But what is noticeable about all these writers is that what purpose they have is very much up in the air. There is no attention to the urgent problems of the moment. Above all, no politics in the narrower sense. Our eyes are directed to Rome, to Byzantium, to Montparnasse, to Mexico, to the Etruscans, to the subconscious, to the solar plexus, to everywhere except the places where things are actually happening. When one looks back at the 20s, nothing is queerer than the way in which every important event in Europe escaped the notice of the English intelligentsia. The Russian Revolution, for instance, all but vanishes from the English consciousness between the death of Lenin and the Ukraine famine, about 10 years. Throughout those years, Russia means Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and exiled counts driving taxicabs. Italy means picture galleries, ruins, churches and museums, but not black shirts. Germany means films, nudism, and psychoanalysis, but not Hitler, of whom hardly anyone had heard till 1931. In cultured circles, art for art's sake extended practically to a worship of the meaningless. Literature was supposed to consist solely in the manipulation of words. To judge a book by its subject matter was the unforgivable sin, and even to be aware of its subject matter was looked on as a lapse of taste. About 1928, in one of the 3 genuinely funny jokes that Punch has produced since the Great War, an intolerable youth is pictured informing his aunt that he intends to write. "And what are you going to write about, dear?" asks the aunt. "My dear aunt," says the youth crushingly, "one doesn't write about anything. One just writes." The best writers of the 20s did not subscribe to this doctrine. Their purpose is, in most cases, fairly overt, but it is usually a purpose along moral, religious, cultural lines. Also, when translatable into political terms, it is in no case left. In one way or another, the tendency of all the writers in this group is conservative. Lewis, for instance, spent years in frenzied witch smellings after Bolshevism, which he was able to detect in very unlikely places. Recently, he has changed some of his views, perhaps influenced by Hitler's treatment of artists, but it is safe to bet that he will not go very far leftward. Pound seems to have plumped definitely for fascism, at any rate the Italian variety. Eliot has remained aloof, but if forced at the pistol's point to choose between fascism and some more democratic form of socialism, would probably choose fascism. Huxley starts off with the usual despair of life, then, under the influence of Lawrence's dark abdomen, tries something called life worship, and finally arrives at pacifism, a tenable position, and at this moment an honourable one, but probably in the long run involving rejection of socialism. It is also noticeable that most of the writers in this group have a certain tenderness for the Catholic Church, though not usually of a kind that an Orthodox Catholic would accept. The mental connection between pessimism and a reactionary outlook is no doubt obvious enough. What is perhaps less obvious is just why the leading writers of the 20s were predominantly pessimistic. Why always the sense of decadence, the skulls and cactuses, the yearning after lost faith and impossible civilizations? Was it not, after all, because these people were writing in an exceptionally comfortable epoch? It is just in such times that cosmic despair can flourish. People with empty bellies never despair of the universe, nor even think about the universe, for that matter. The whole period, 1910 through 30, was a prosperous one, and even the war years were physically tolerable if one happened to be a non-combatant in one of the Allied countries. As for the 20s, they were the golden age of the rentier intellectual, a period of irresponsibility such as the world had never before seen. The war was over. The new totalitarian states had not arisen. Moral and religious taboos of all descriptions had vanished, and the cash was rolling in. Disillusionment was all the fashion. Everyone with a safe £500 a year turned highbrow and began training himself in tedium vitae. It was an age of eagles and of crumpets, facile despairs, backyard hamlets, cheap return tickets to the end of the night. In some of the minor characteristic novels of the period, books like Told by an Idiot, the despair of life reaches a Turkish bath atmosphere of self-pity, and even the best writers of the time can be convicted of a too Olympian attitude, a too great readiness to wash their hands of the immediate practical problem. They see life very comprehensively, much more so than those who come immediately before or after them, but they see it through the wrong end of the telescope. Not that that invalidates their books as books. The first test of any work of art is survival, and it is a fact that a great deal that was written in the period 1910 through 30 has survived and looks like continuing to survive. One has only to think of Ulysses, of Human Bondage, much of Lawrence's early work, especially his short stories, and virtually the whole of Eliot's poems up to about 1930, to wonder what is now being written that will wear so well. But, quite suddenly, in the years 1930 through 35, something happens. The literary climate changes. A new group of writers, Auden and Spender and the rest of them, has made its appearance, and although technically these writers owe something to their predecessors, their tendency is entirely different. Suddenly we have got out of the twilight of the gods into a sort of Boy Scout atmosphere of bare knees and community singing. The typical literary man ceases to be a cultured expatriate with a leaning towards the church, and becomes an eager-minded schoolboy with a leaning towards communism. If the keynote of the writers of the 20s is tragic sense of life, the keynote of the new writers is serious purpose. The differences between the two schools are discussed at some length in Mr. Lewis MacNeice's book, Modern Poetry. This book is, of course, written entirely from the angle of the younger group, and takes the superiority of their standards for granted. According to Mr. MacNeice, the poets of new signatures, unlike Yeats and Eliot, are emotionally partisan. Yeats proposed to turn his back on desire and hatred. Eliot sat back and watched other people's emotions with ennui and an ironical self-pity. The whole poetry, on the other hand, of Auden, Spender, and Day-Lewis implies that they have desires and hatreds of their own, and, further, that they think some things ought to be desired and others hated. And again, the poets of new signatures have swung back to the Greek preference for information or statement. The first requirement is to have something to say, and after that you must say it as well as you can. In other words, purpose has come back. The younger writers have gone into politics. As I have pointed out already, Eliot and Co. are not really so non-partisan as Mr. McNeice seems to suggest. Still, it is broadly true that in the 20s, the literary emphasis was more on technique and less on subject matter than it is now. The leading figures in this group are Auden, Spender, Day-Lewis, McNeice, and there is a long string of writers of more or less the same tendency: Isherwood, John Lemon, Arthur Calder Marshall, Edward Upward, Alec Brown, Philip Henderson, and many others. As before, I am lumping them together simply according to tendency. Obviously, there are very great variations in talent. But when one compares these writers with the Joyce Eliot generation, the immediately striking thing is how much easier it is to form them into a group. Technically, they are closer together. Politically, they are almost indistinguishable, and their criticisms of one another's work have always been, to put it mildly, good-natured. The outstanding writers of the 20s were of very varied origins. Few of them had passed through the ordinary English educational mill. Incidentally, the best of them, barring Lawrence, were not Englishmen, and most of them had at some time to struggle against poverty, neglect, and even downright persecution. On the other hand, nearly all the younger writers fit easily into the public school university Bloomsbury pattern. The few who are of proletarian origin are of the kind that is declassed early in life, first by means of scholarships, and then by the bleaching tub of London culture. It is significant that several of the writers in this group have been not only boys but, subsequently, masters at public schools. Some years ago, I described Auden as a sort of gutless Kipling. As criticism, this was quite unworthy. Indeed, it was merely a spiteful remark. But it is a fact that in Auden's work, especially his earlier work, an atmosphere of uplift, something rather like Kipling's If, or Newbolt's play up, and play the game, never seems to be very far away. Take, for instance, a poem like You're Leaving Now, and It's Up to You Boys. It is pure Scoutmaster, the exact note of a 10 minutes straight talk on the dangers of self-abuse. No doubt there is an element of parody that he intends, but there is also a deeper resemblance that he does not intend. And, of course, the rather priggish note that is common to most of these writers is a symptom of release. By throwing pure art overboard, they have freed themselves from the fear of being laughed at and vastly enlarged their scope. The prophetic side of Marxism, for example, is new material for poetry and has great possibilities. We are nothing. We have fallen into the dark and shall be destroyed. Think through that in this darkness we hold the secret hub of an idea. whose living sunlit wheel revolves in future years outside. Spender, trial of a judge. But at the same time, by being Marxized, literature has moved no nearer to the masses. Even allowing for the time lag, Auden and Spender are somewhat farther from being popular writers than Joyce and Eliot, let alone Lawrence. As before, there are many contemporary writers who are outside the current, but there is not much doubt about what is the current. For the middle and late 30s, Auden, Spender, and co. are the movement, just as Joyce, Eliot, and co. were for the 20s. And the movement is in the direction of some rather ill-defined thing called communism. As early as 1934 or 1935, it was considered eccentric in literary circles to not be more or less left, and in another year or two there had grown up a left-wing orthodoxy that made a certain set of opinions absolutely de rigueur on certain subjects. The idea had begun to gain ground, vide Edward Upward and others, that a writer must either be actively left or write badly. Between 1935 and 1939, the Communist Party had an almost irresistible fascination for any writer under 40. It became as normal to hear that so-and-so had joined as it had been a few years earlier, when Roman Catholicism was fashionable, to hear that so-and-so had been received. For about 3 years, in fact, the central stream of English literature was more or less directly under communist control. How was it possible for such a thing to happen? And at the same time, what is meant by communism? It is better to answer the second question first. The communist movement in Western Europe began as a movement for the violent overthrow of capitalism, and degenerated within a few years into an instrument of Russian foreign policy. This was probably inevitable when the revolutionary ferment that followed the Great War had died down. So far as I know, the only comprehensive history of this subject in English is Franz Borkenau's book, The Communist International. What Borkenau's facts, even more than his deductions, make clear is that communism could never have developed along its present lines if any real revolutionary feeling had existed in the industrialized countries. In England, for instance, it is obvious that no such feeling has existed for years past. The pathetic membership figure of all extremist parties show this clearly. It is only natural, therefore, that the English communist movement should be controlled by people who are mentally subservient to Russia and have no real aim except to manipulate British foreign policy in the Russian interest. Of course, such an aim cannot be openly admitted, and it is this fact that gives the Communist Party its very peculiar character. The more vocal kind of communist is in effect a Russian publicity agent posing as an international socialist. It is a pose that is easily kept up at normal times, but becomes difficult in moments of crisis, because of the fact that the USSR is no more scrupulous in its foreign policy than the rest of the great powers. Alliances, changes of front, etc., which only make sense as part of the game of power politics, have to be explained and justified in terms of international socialism. Every time Stalin swaps partners, Marxism has to be hammered into a new shape. This entails sudden and violent changes of line, purges, denunciations, systematic destruction of party literature, etc., etc. Every communist is in fact liable at any moment to have to alter his most fundamental convictions, or leave the party. The unquestionable dogma of Monday may become the damnable heresy of Tuesday, and so on. This has happened at least 3 times during the past 10 years. It follows that in any Western country, a communist party is always unstable and usually very small. Its long-term membership really consists of an inner ring of intellectuals who have identified with the Russian bureaucracy, and a slightly larger body of working-class people who feel a loyalty towards Soviet Russia without necessarily understanding its policies. Otherwise, there is only a shifting membership, one lot coming and another going with each change of line. In 1930, the English Communist Party was a tiny, barely legal organization whose main activity was libeling the Labour Party. But by 1935, the face of Europe had changed, and left-wing politics changed with it. Hitler had risen to power and begun to rearm. The Russian 5-year plans had succeeded. Russia had reappeared as a great military power. As Hitler's 3 targets of attack were, to all appearances, Great Britain, France, and the USSR, the 3 countries were forced into a sort of uneasy rapprochement. This meant that the English or French communist was obliged to become a good patriot and imperialist, that is, to defend the very things he had been attacking for the past 15 years. The Comintern slogans suddenly faded from red to pink. World revolution and social fascism gave way to defense of democracy and stop Hitler. The years 1935 through 39 were the period of anti-fascism and the Popular Front, the heyday of the Left Book Club, when red duchesses and broad-minded deans toured the battlefields of the Spanish War, and Winston Churchill was the blue-eyed boy of the Daily Worker. Since then, of course, there has been yet another change of line. But what is important for my purpose is that it was during the anti-fascist phase that the younger English writers gravitated towards communism. The fascism-democracy dogfight was no doubt an attraction in itself, but in any case, their conversion was due at about that date. It was obvious that laissez-faire capitalism was finished, and that there had got to be some kind of reconstruction. In the world of 1935, it was hardly possible to remain politically indifferent. But why did these young men turn towards anything so alien as Russian communism? Why should writers be attracted by a form of socialism that makes mental honesty impossible? The explanation really lies in something that had already made itself felt before the slump and before Hitler: middle-class unemployment. Unemployment is not merely a matter of not having a job. Most people can get a job of sorts, even at the worst of times. The trouble was that by about 1930, there was no activity, except perhaps scientific research, the arts, and left-wing politics, that a thinking person could believe in. The debunking of Western civilization had reached its climax, and disillusionment was immensely widespread. Who now could take it for granted to go through life in the ordinary middle-class way, as a soldier, a clergyman, a stockbroker, an Indian civil servant, or what not? And how many of the values by which our grandfathers lived could now be taken seriously? Patriotism, religion, the empire, the family, the sanctity of marriage, the old school tie, birth breeding, honor, discipline. Anyone of ordinary education could turn the whole lot of them inside out in 3 minutes. But what do you achieve, after all, by getting rid of such primal things as patriotism and religion? You have not necessarily got rid of the need for something to believe in. There had been a sort of false dawn a few years earlier, when numbers of young intellectuals, including several quite gifted writers, Evelyn Waugh, Christopher Hollis, and others, had fled into the Catholic Church. It is significant that these people went almost invariably to the Roman Church and not, for instance, to the C of E, the Greek Church, or the Protestant sects. They went, that is, to the Church with a worldwide organization, the one with a rigid discipline, the one with power and prestige behind it. Perhaps it is even worth noticing that the only latter-day convert of really first-rate gifts, Eliot, has embraced not Romanism but Anglo-Catholicism, the ecclesiastical equivalent of Trotskyism. But I do not think one need look farther than this for the reason why the young writers of the 30s flocked into or towards the Communist Party. It was simply something to believe in. Here was a church, an army, an orthodoxy, a discipline. Here was a fatherland and, at any rate since 1935 or thereabouts, a Führer. All the loyalties and superstitions that the intellect had seemingly banished could come rushing back under the thinnest of disguises. Patriotism, religion, empire, military glory, all in one word. Russia. Father, king, leader, hero, savior, all in one word. Stalin. God, Stalin. The devil, Hitler. Heaven, Moscow. Hell, Berlin. All the gaps were filled up. So, after all, the communism of the English intellectual is something explicable enough. It is the patriotism of the deracinated. But there is one other thing that undoubtedly contributed to the cult of Russia among the English intelligentsia during these years, and that is the softness and security of life in England itself. With all its injustices, England is still a land of habeas corpus, and the overwhelming majority of English people have no experience of violence or illegality. If you have grown up in that sort of atmosphere, it is not at all easy to imagine what a despotic regime is like. Nearly all the dominant writers of the 30s belonged to the soft-boiled, emancipated middle class, and were too young to have effective memories of the Great War. To people of that kind, such things as purges, secret police, summary executions, imprisonment without trial, etc., etc., are too remote to be terrifying. They can swallow totalitarianism because they have no experience of anything except liberalism. Look, for instance, at this extract from Mr. Auden's poem, Spain. Incidentally, this poem is one of the few decent things that have been written about the Spanish War. Tomorrow for the young, the poets exploding like bombs. The walks by the lake, the weeks of perfect communion. Tomorrow the bicycle races, through the suburbs on summer evenings. But today the struggle, today the deliberate increase in the chances of death, the conscious acceptance of guilt in the necessary murder. Today the expending of powers, on the flat ephemeral pamphlet and the boring meeting. The second stanza is intended as a sort of tabloid picture of a day in the life of a good party man. In the morning, a couple of political murders, a 10-minute interlude to stifle bourgeois remorse, and then a hurried luncheon and a busy afternoon and evening chalking walls and distributing leaflets. All very edifying. But notice the phrase, necessary murder. It could only be written by a person to whom murder is, at most, a word. Personally, I would not speak so lightly of murder. It so happens that I have seen the bodies of numbers of murdered men. I don't mean killed in battle, I mean murdered. Therefore, I have some conception of what murder means. The terror, the hatred, the howling relatives, the post-mortems, the blood, the smells. To me, murder is something to be avoided. So it is to any ordinary person. The Hitlers and Stalins find murder necessary, but they don't advertise their callousness, and they don't speak of it as murder. It is liquidation, elimination, or some other soothing phrase. Mr. Auden's brand of amoralism is only possible if you are the kind of person who is always somewhere else when the trigger is pulled. So much of left-wing thought is a kind of playing with fire by people who don't even know that fire is hot. The warmongering to which the English intelligentsia gave themselves up in the period 1935 through 39 was largely based on a sense of personal immunity. The attitude was very different in France, where the military service is hard to dodge, and even literary men know the weight of a pack. Towards the end of Mr. Cyril Connolly's recent book, Enemies of Promise, there occurs an interesting and revealing passage. The first part of the book is, more or less, an evaluation of present-day literature. Mr. Connolly belongs exactly to the generation of the writers of The Movement, and with not many reservations, their values are his values. It is interesting to notice that among the prose writers, he admires chiefly those specializing in violence, the would-be tough American school, Hemingway, etc. The latter part of the book, however, is autobiographical and consists of an account, fascinatingly accurate, of life at a preparatory school and Eton in the years 1910 through 20. Mr. Connolly ends by remarking, "Were I to deduce anything from my feelings on leaving Eton, it might be called the theory of permanent adolescence. It is the theory that the experiences undergone by boys at the great public schools are so intense as to dominate their lives and to arrest their development." When you read the second sentence in this passage, your natural impulse is to look for the misprint. Perhaps there is a "not" left out, or something. But no, not a bit of it. He means it. And, what is more, he is merely speaking the truth, in an inverted fashion. Cultured, middle-class life has reached a depth of softness at which a public school education, 5 years in a lukewarm bath of snobbery, can actually be looked back upon as an eventful period. To nearly all the writers who have counted during the 30s, what more has ever happened than Mr. Connolly records in Enemies of Promise? It is the same pattern all the time. Public school, university, a few trips abroad, then London. Hunger, hardship, solitude, exile, war, prison, persecution, manual labor, hardly even words. No wonder that the huge tribe known as the Right-Left people found it so easy to condone the purge and occupy side of the Russian regime and the horrors of the first 5-year plan. They were so gloriously incapable of understanding what it all meant. By 1937, the whole of the intelligentsia was mentally at war. Left-wing thought had narrowed down to anti-fascism, i.e., to a negative and a torrent of hate literature directed against Germany, and the politicians supposedly friendly to Germany was pouring from the press. The thing that, to me, was truly frightening about the war in Spain was not such violence as I witnessed, nor even the party feuds between the lines, but the immediate reappearance in left-wing circles of the mental atmosphere of the Great War. The very people who, for 20 years, had sniggered over their own superiority to war hysteria were the ones who rushed straight back into the mental slum of 1915. All the familiar wartime idiocies, spy hunting, orthodoxy sniffing, sniff, sniff. Are you a good anti-fascist? The retailing of incredible atrocity stories came back into vogue as though the intervening years had never happened. Before the end of the Spanish War, and even before Munich, some of the better of the left-wing writers were beginning to squirm. Neither Auden nor, on the whole, Spender wrote about the Spanish War in quite the vein that was expected of them. Since then, there has been a change of feeling and much dismay and confusion, because the actual course of events has made nonsense of the left-wing orthodoxy of the last few years. But then, it did not need very great acuteness to see that much of it was nonsense from the start. There is no certainty, therefore, that the next orthodoxy to emerge will be any better than the last. On the whole, the literary history of the 30s seems to justify the opinion that a writer does well to keep out of politics. For any writer who accepts, or partially accepts, the discipline of a political party is sooner or later faced with the alternative: toe the line or shut up. It is, of course, possible to toe the line and go on writing, after a fashion. Any Marxist can demonstrate with the greatest of ease that bourgeois liberty of thought is an illusion. But when he has finished his demonstration, there remains the psychological fact that without this bourgeois liberty, the creative powers wither away. In the future, a totalitarian literature may arise, but it will be quite different from anything we can now imagine. Literature, as we know it, is an individual thing, demanding mental honesty and a minimum of censorship. And this is even truer of prose than of verse. It is probably not a coincidence that the best writers of the 30s have been poets. The atmosphere of orthodoxy is always damaging to prose, and, above all, it is completely ruinous to the novel, the most anarchical of all forms of literature. How many Roman Catholics have been good novelists? Even the handful one could name have usually been bad Catholics. The novel is practically a Protestant form of art. It is a product of the free mind, of the autonomous individual. No decade in the past 150 years has been so barren of imaginative prose as the 1930s. There have been good poems, good sociological works, brilliant pamphlets, but practically no fiction of any value at all. From 1933 onwards, the mental climate was increasingly against it. Anyone sensitive enough to be touched by the zeitgeist was also involved in politics. Not everyone, of course, was definitely in the political racket, but practically everyone was on its periphery and, more or less, mixed up in propaganda campaigns and squalid controversies. Communists and near-communists had a disproportionately large influence in the literary reviews. It was a time of labels, slogans, and evasions. At the worst moments, you were expected to lock yourself up in a constipating little cage of lies. At the best, a sort of voluntary censorship. Ought I to say this? Is it pro-fascist? Was at work in nearly everyone's mind. It is almost inconceivable that good novels should be written in such an atmosphere. Good novels are not written by orthodoxy sniffers, nor by people who are conscience-stricken about their own unorthodoxy. Good novels are written by people who are not frightened. This brings me back to Henry Miller. If this were a likely moment for a launching of schools of literature, Henry Miller might be the starting point of a new school. He does, at any rate, mark an unexpected swing of the pendulum. In his books, one gets right away from the political animal and back to a viewpoint not only individualistic, but completely passive. The viewpoint of a man who believes the world process to be outside his control, and who, in any case, hardly wishes to control it. I first met Miller at the end of 1936, when I was passing through Paris on my way to Spain. What most intrigued me about him was to find that he felt no interest in the Spanish War whatever. He merely told me, in forcible terms, that to go to Spain at the moment was the act of an idiot. He could understand anyone going there from purely selfish motives, out of curiosity, for instance, but to mix oneself up in such things from a sense of obligation was sheer stupidity. In any case, my ideas about combating fascism, defending democracy, etc., etc., were all baloney. Our civilization was destined to be swept away and replaced by something so different that we should scarcely regard it as human, a prospect that did not bother him, he said. And some such outlook is implicit throughout his work. Everywhere there is the sense of the approaching cataclysm, and almost everywhere the implied belief that it doesn't matter. The only political declaration which, so far as I know, he has ever made in print is a purely negative one. A year or so ago, an American magazine, the Marxist Quarterly, sent out a questionnaire to various American writers, asking them to define their attitude on the subject of war. Miller replied in terms of extreme pacifism, but a merely personal pacifism, an individual refusal to fight, with no apparent wish to convert others to the same opinion. Practically, in fact, a declaration of irresponsibility. However, there is more than one kind of irresponsibility. As a rule, writers who do not wish to identify themselves with the historical process of the moment either ignore it or fight against it. If they can ignore it, they are probably fools. If they can understand it well enough to want to fight against it, they probably have enough vision to realize that they cannot win. Look, for instance, at a poem like The Scholar Gypsy, with its railing against the strange disease of modern life and its magnificent defeatist simile in the final stanza. It expresses one of the normal literary attitudes, perhaps actually the prevailing attitude during the last 100 years. And, on the other hand, there are the progressives, the yay-sayers, the Shaw-Wells type, always leaping forward to embrace the ego projections which they mistake for the future. On the whole, the writers of the 20s took the first line, and the writers of the 30s the second. At any given moment, of course, there is a huge tribe of Barrys and Deepings and Dells who simply don't notice what is happening. Where Miller's work is symptomatically important is in its avoidance of any of these attitudes. He is neither pushing the world process forward, nor trying to drag it back. But, on the other hand, he is by no means ignoring it. I should say that he believes in the impending ruin of Western civilization much more firmly than the majority of revolutionary writers. Only he does not feel called upon to do anything about it. He is fiddling while Rome is burning, and, unlike the enormous majority of people who do this, fiddling with his face towards the flames. In Max and the White Phagocytes, there is one of those revealing passages in which a writer tells you a great deal about himself while talking about somebody else. The book includes a long essay on the diaries of a nice nin, which I have never read, except for a few fragments, and which, I believe, have not been published. Miller claims that they are the only truly feminine writing that has ever appeared, whatever that may mean. But the interesting passage is one in which he compares a nice nin, evidently a completely subjective, introverted writer, to Jonah in the whale's belly. In passing, he refers to an essay that Aldous Huxley wrote some years ago about El Greco's picture, The Dream of Philip II. Huxley remarks that the people in El Greco's pictures always look as though they were in the bellies of whales, and professes to find something peculiarly horrible in the idea of being in a visceral prison. Miller retorts that, on the contrary, there are many worse things than being swallowed by whales, and the passage makes it clear that he himself finds the idea rather attractive. Here he is touching upon what is probably a very widespread fantasy. It is perhaps noticing that everyone, at least every English-speaking person, invariably speaks of Jonah and the whale. Of course, the creature that swallowed Jonah was a fish, and is so described in the Bible, Jonah 1:17. But children naturally confuse it with a whale, and this fragment of baby talk is habitually carried into later life, a sign, perhaps, of the hold that the Jonah myth has upon our imaginations. For the fact is that being inside a whale is a very comfortable, cozy, home-like thought. The historical Jonah, if he can be so called, was glad enough to escape. But in imagination, in daydream, countless people have envied him. It is, of course, quite obvious why. The whale's belly is simply a womb big enough for an adult. There you are, in the dark, cushioned space that exactly fits you, with yards of blubber between yourself and reality, able to keep up an attitude of the completest indifference, no matter what happens. A storm that would sink all the battleships in the world would hardly reach you as an echo. Even the whale's own movements would probably be imperceptible to you. He might be wallowing across the surface wave, or shooting down into the blackness of the middle seas, a mile deep, according to Herman Melville. but you would never notice the difference. Short of being dead, it is the final, unsurpassable stage of irresponsibility. And however it may be with a nice nin, there is no question that Miller himself is inside the whale. All his best and most characteristic passages are written from the angle of Jonah, a willing Jonah. Not that he is especially introverted, quite the contrary. In his case, the whale happens to be transparent. Only he feels no impulse to alter or control the process that he is undergoing. He has performed the essential Jonah act of allowing himself to be swallowed, remaining passive, accepting. It will be seen what this amounts to. It is a species of quietism, implying either complete unbelief or else a degree of belief amounting to mysticism. The attitude is je m'en fous, or though he slay me, yet will I trust in him, whichever way you like to look at it. For practical purposes, both are identical, the moral in either case being sit on your bum. But in a time like ours, is this a defensible attitude? Notice that it is almost impossible to refrain from asking this question. At the moment of writing, we are still in a period in which it is taken for granted that books ought always to be positive, serious, and constructive. A dozen years ago, this idea would have been greeted with titters. My dear aunt, one doesn't write about anything. One just writes. Then the pendulum swung away from the frivolous notion that art is merely technique. But it swung a very long distance, to the point of asserting that a book can only be good if it is founded on a true vision of life. Naturally, the people who believe this also believe that they are in possession of the truth themselves. Catholic critics, for instance, tend to claim that books are only good when they are of Catholic tendency. Marxist critics make the same claim more boldly for Marxist books. For instance, Mr. Edward Upward, a Marxist interpretation of literature, in The Mind in Chains. Literary criticism which aims at being Marxist must proclaim that no book written at the present time can be good unless it is written from a Marxist or near-Marxist viewpoint. Various other writers have made similar or comparable statements. Mr. Upward italicizes at the present time because he realizes that you cannot, for instance, dismiss Hamlet on the ground that Shakespeare was not a Marxist. Nevertheless, his interesting essay only glances very shortly at this difficulty. Much of the literature that comes to us out of the past is permeated by, and in fact founded on, beliefs. The belief in the immortality of the soul, for example, which now seem to us false, and in some cases contemptibly silly. Yet it is good literature, if survival is any test. Mr. Upward would no doubt answer that a belief which was appropriate several centuries ago might be inappropriate and therefore stultifying now. But this does not get one much farther, because it assumes that in any age there will be one body of belief which is the current approximation to truth, and that the best literature of the time will be more or less in harmony with it. Actually, no such uniformity has ever existed. In 17th century England, for instance, there was a religious and political cleavage which distinctly resembled the left-right antagonism of today. Looking back, most modern people would feel that the bourgeois Puritan viewpoint was a better approximation to truth than the Catholic feudal one. But it is certainly not the case that all, or even a majority, of the best writers of the time were Puritans. And, more than this, there exist good writers whose worldview would in any age be recognized as false and silly. Edgar Allan Poe is an example. Poe's outlook is, at best, a wild romanticism, and at worst, is not far from being insane in the literal, clinical sense. Why is it, then, that stories like The Black Cat, The Telltale Heart, The Fall of the House of Usher, and so forth, which might very nearly have been written by a lunatic, do not convey a feeling of falsity? Because they are true within a certain framework, they keep the rules of their own peculiar world, like a Japanese picture. But it appears that to write successfully about such a world, you have got to believe in it. One sees the difference immediately if one compares Poe's tales with what is, in my opinion, an insincere attempt to work up a similar atmosphere, Julian Green's Minute. The thing that immediately strikes one about Minute is that there is no reason why any of the events in it should happen. Everything is completely arbitrary. There is no emotional sequence. But this is exactly what one does not feel with Poe's stories. Their maniacal logic, in its own setting, is quite convincing. When, for instance, the drunkard seizes the black cat and cuts out its eye with the penknife, one knows exactly why he did it, even to the point of feeling that one would have done the same oneself. It seems, therefore, that for a creative writer, possession of the truth is less important than emotional sincerity. Even Mr. Upperwood would not claim that a writer needs nothing beyond a Marxist training. He also needs talent. But talent, apparently, is a matter of being able to care, of really believing in your beliefs, whether they are true or false. The difference between, for instance, Celine and Evelyn Waugh is a difference of emotional intensity. It is the difference between a genuine despair and a despair that is, at least partly, a pretense. And with this, there goes another consideration which is perhaps less obvious, that there are occasions when an untrue belief is more likely to be sincerely held than a true one. If one looks at the books of personal reminiscence written about the war of 1914 through 18, one notices that nearly all that have remained readable after a lapse of time are written from a passive, negative angle. They are the records of something completely meaningless, a nightmare happening in a void. That was not actually the truth about the war, but it was the truth about the individual reaction. The soldier advancing into a machine gun barrage, or standing waist-deep in a flooded trench, knew only that here was an appalling experience in which he was all but helpless. He was likelier to make a good book out of his helplessness and his ignorance than out of a pretended power to see the whole thing in perspective. As for the books that were written during the war itself, the best of them were nearly all the work of people who simply turned their backs and tried not to notice that the war was happening. Mr. E.M. Forster has described how in 1917 he read Prufrock and others of Eliot's early poems, and how it heartened him at such a time to get hold of poems that were innocent of public spiritedness. They sang of private disgust and diffidence, and of people who seemed genuine because they were unattractive or weak. Here was a protest, and a feeble one, and the more congenial for being feeble. He who could turn aside to complain of ladies and drawing rooms preserved a tiny drop of our self-respect. He carried on the human heritage. That is very well said. Mr. McNeice, in the book I have referred to already, quotes this passage, and somewhat smugly adds, 10 years later, less feeble protests were to be made by poets, and the human heritage carried on rather differently. The contemplation of a world of fragments becomes boring, and Eliot's successors are more interested in tidying it up. Similar remarks are scattered throughout Mr. McNeice's book. What he wishes us to believe is that Eliot's successors, meaning Mr. McNeice and his friends, have, in some way, protested more effectively than Eliot did by publishing Prufrock at the moment when the Allied armies were assaulting the Hindenburg Line. Just where these protests are to be found, I do not know. But in the contrast between Mr. Forster's comment and Mr. Nice's lies all the difference between a man who knows what the 1914-18 war was like and a man who barely remembers it. The truth is that in 1917 there was nothing that a thinking and sensitive person could do except to remain human, if possible. And a gesture of helplessness, even of frivolity, might be the best way of doing that. If I had been a soldier fighting in the Great War, I would sooner have got hold of Prufrock than The First 100,000, or Horatio Bottomley's Letters to the Boys in the Trenches. I should have felt, like Mr. Forster, that by simply standing aloof and keeping touch with pre-war emotions, Eliot was carrying on the human heritage. What a relief it would have been at such a time to read about the hesitations of a middle-aged highbrow with a bald spot, so different from a bayonet drill. After the bombs and the food queues and the recruiting posters, a human voice. What a relief. But, after all, the war of 1914-18 was only a heightened moment in an almost continuous crisis. At this date, it hardly even needs a war to bring home to us the disintegration of our society and the increasing helplessness of all decent people. It is for this reason that I think that the passive, non-cooperative attitude implied in Henry Miller's work is justified. Whether or not it is an expression of what people ought to feel, it probably comes somewhere near to expressing what they do feel. Once again, it is the human voice among the bomb explosions, a friendly American voice, innocent of public spiritedness. No sermons, merely the subjective truth. And, along those lines, apparently, it is still possible for a good novel to be written. Not necessarily an edifying novel, but a novel worth reading, and likely to be remembered after it is read. While I have been writing this book, another European war has broken out. It will either last several years and tear Western civilization to pieces, or it will end inconclusively and prepare the way for yet another war which will do the job once and for all. But war is only peace intensified. What is quite obviously happening, war or no war, is the breakup of laissez-faire capitalism and of the liberal Christian culture. Until recently, the full implications of this were not foreseen, because it was generally imagined that socialism could preserve and even enlarge the atmosphere of liberalism. It is now beginning to be realized how false this idea was. Almost certainly, We are moving into an age of totalitarian dictatorships, an age in which freedom of thought will be at first a deadly sin, and later on a meaningless abstraction. The autonomous individual is going to be stamped out of existence. But this means that literature, in the form in which we know it, must suffer at least a temporary death. The literature of liberalism is coming to an end, and the literature of totalitarianism has not yet appeared and is barely imaginable. As for the writer, he is sitting on a melting iceberg. He is merely an anachronism, a hangover from the bourgeois age, as surely doomed as the hippopotamus. Miller seems to me a man out of the common, because he saw and proclaimed this fact a long while before most of his contemporaries, at a time, indeed, when many of them were actually burbling about a renaissance of literature. Wyndham Lewis had said years earlier that the major history of the English language was finished, but he was basing this on different and rather trivial reasons. But from now onwards, the all-important fact for the creative writer is going to be that this is not a writer's world. That does not mean that he cannot help to bring the new society into being, but he can take no part in the process as a writer. For as a writer he is a liberal, and what is happening is the destruction of liberalism. It seems likely, therefore, that in the remaining years of free speech, any novel worth reading will follow more or less along the lines that Miller has followed. I do not mean in technique or subject matter, but in implied outlook. The passive attitude will come back, and it will be more consciously passive than before. Progress and reaction have both turned out to be swindles. Seemingly, there is nothing left but quietism, robbing reality of its terrors by simply submitting to it. Get inside the whale, or rather, admit that you are inside the whale, for you are, of course. Give yourself over to the world process. Stop fighting against it, or pretending that you control it. Simply accept it, endure it, record it. That seems to be the formula that any sensitive novelist is now likely to adopt. A novel on more positive, constructive lines, and not emotionally spurious, is at present very difficult to imagine. But I do mean by this that Miller is a great author, a new hope for English prose? Nothing of the kind. Miller himself would be the last to claim or want any such thing. No doubt he will go on writing. Anybody who has once started always goes on writing, and associated with him there is a number of writers of approximately the same tendency: Lawrence Durrell, Michael Frankel, and others, almost amounting to a school. But he himself seems to me essentially a man of one book. Sooner or later, I should expect him to descend into unintelligibility, or into charlatanism. There are signs of both in his later work. His last book, Tropic of Capricorn, I have not even read. This was not because I did not want to read it, but because the police and customs authorities have, so far, managed to prevent me from getting hold of it. But it would surprise me if it came anywhere near Tropic of Cancer or the opening chapters of Black Spring. Like certain other autobiographical novelists, he had it in him to do just one thing perfectly, and he did it. Considering what the fiction of the 1930s has been like, that is something. Miller's books are published by the Obelisk Press in Paris. What will happen to the Obelisk Press now that war has broken out and Jack Kahane, the publisher, is dead? I do not know, but at any rate the books are still procurable. I earnestly counsel anyone who has not done so to read at least Tropic of Cancer. With a little ingenuity, or by paying a little over the published price, you can get hold of it. And even if parts of it disgust you, it will stick in your memory. It is also an important book, in a sense different from the sense in which that word is generally used. As a rule, novels are spoken of as important when they are either a terrible indictment of something or other, or when they introduce some technical innovation. Neither of these applies to Tropic of Cancer. Its importance is merely symptomatic. Here, in my opinion, is the only imaginative prose writer of the slightest value who has appeared among the English-speaking races for some years past. Even if that is objected to as an overstatement, it will probably be admitted that Miller is a writer out of the ordinary, worth more than a single glance. And, after all, he is a completely negative, unconstructive, amoral writer, a mere Jonah, a passive acceptor of evil, a sort of Whitman among the corpses. Symptomatically, that is more significant than the mere fact that 5,000 novels are published in England every year, and 4,900 of them are tripe. It is a demonstration of the impossibility of any major literature until the world has shaken itself into its new shape.